I do a lot of voluntary work at our local hospital as a consultant, not a medical consultant, but on research projects and so on. And very often I come across doctors and nurses from abroad. Um, and when they find out what my career has been, then they always ask me, can you explain why I got good grades all the way through college, university? And these are doctors and nurses. And yet I've come over to the UK and I cannot understand what ordinary people are saying. And the reason for that is it's the input. It's the kind of listening we do in standard ELT lessons. It's not the right input. And the reason for that is that the publishers are locked into English for modelling. So typical unit in a course book, it will start with a dialogue, very good, but that dialogue has been scripted and it's been graded to the student's level. And worst of all, it's performed by actors who are very different from ordinary people. They articulate very clearly. I know this. We have quite a few actors in our local pub, and you can always tell when they're there, however distant they are, because you can hear exactly what they're saying. So the input is not real life input. It's fantastic for modelling and for teaching new language, by which I
Hmm.
mean lexis and grammar, but it's not real life input. It's not going to help them cope with the real life language outside the classroom. And the problem with those doctors and nurses is they have not been exposed to the right input. They've passed their exams, they've done really well, but when they're confronted by real life speakers of the language, it's very, very difficult for them to understand. One thing, Leo, you're talking about communication. I really focus on listening rather than listening and speaking combined. So
Hmm.
that's a pure focus on listening. I think really there's been a move to say, well, whenever we're listening, we're with other people, we're communicating. But in fact, in terms of teaching listening, you need to focus solely on the audio.
Hmm.
Penny made the point that if students can listen and understand just the audio input, just how much better they can understand when they can see body language and facial features and everything. But in the classroom, it's far better just to concentrate on audio. And again, in teaching, there's been a move to have videos, but then you have the problem with learners split attention span, so they're watching what's going on, they're also listening, and it's hard. And this is another feature that we're not open and honest with students. We don't tell them how difficult listening is in another language. It's ever so challenging. It takes a lot of cognitive effort, but we pretend, oh, no, it's fine, and everything's easy and fun. And I'm afraid learning a language isn't necessarily fun. It requires a huge amount of effort, and listening in particular.
And I wonder if
It's
you mentioned the model, the actors and what they do to perhaps make the text clearer. When you were speaking, I was thinking also a little bit perhaps about variety as well, right? Variety of accents and
Hmm.
dialects and versions of English across the world, and
Yeah.
how perhaps students might understand a very well kind of modeled text, but maybe struggle with interaction because they're not used to a particular accent or a variety of English. And I don't
Yeah.
know if you've experienced that yourself with the doctors in particular,
Mm.
moving say from their previous context into England or London specifically. Yeah.
Yes, yes, absolutely. But this goes back to trace theory. So the idea is you hear a word in lots of different contexts, said by lots of different people with lots of different accents, and that sets up traces in your mind. So you will recognize that word if you've heard it loads and loads of times before. If you haven't, you won't recognize it. But another factor is the nature of spoken English, which
Mm-hmm.
again we tend not to tackle in course books. It's incredibly hard. It's a hard language to learn. And there are various features of English which make it distinct from other languages. So we have things like co-articulation. When you have words clashing with each other, then the sounds tend to change. That's one problem. Another one which is dealt with in books is things like features of connected speech. So things
Mm-hmm.
like assimilation, where if you say something like seven shirts quickly, it becomes seven instead of seven. Linking, where words run into each other. Um, Elision happens a lot, so hardly anyone says last night unless they're an actor in a course book. They don't say sandwich. Those sounds get elided or are missing. But the main thing is students need of course, they need lots and lots of lexis. But a major problem is they know loads of these words. The fact is, they don't recognise them in a stream of speech. So I did an experiment a few years ago when I was writing my book where I took 20 sections of authentic language. So I did things like 20 extracts just for a few seconds from authentic interviews I'd done. I did them from radio programs, from television programs, and I also did 20 snippets from where we'd had friends coming to visit us in the house that we hadn't seen for a long time. So generally there's a champagne cork popping, but that group interaction. So I took 80 snippets, and I analysed the language of each of those. And in fact, 90% of the words that were used in all those situations were B1 level or below. So they were words that students knew. It was just they don't recognise these known words that are in their productive lexicon, but not when they hear them in a stream of speech. And that's because of what I mentioned before, co-articulation, spoken features of connected speech, and also prosody. Now that is a major, major thing. If you look up prosody in an applied linguistics book, if you're feeling strong enough, that will talk about rhythm, stress, and intonation. So in terms of rhythm, again, this is a kind of fallacy. There is rhythm. If you have a speaker reading aloud a speech, so we're talking about planned spoken English in a formal situation, they will tend to set up a rhythm. But in a lot of language, particularly spontaneous speech, they're not speaking for long enough to set up a rhythm. They're interacting with other people, they're talking over each other, all kinds of things are happening, but the rhythm doesn't apply. And yet, if you look at teacher training books, then that seems to be a major factor. But it isn't, it's only in one type of spoken English. Stress is very important in terms of word stress, and also they talk about sentence stress. But again, this is looking at formal, planned, written, read aloud speech. It's not informal English. And there, what happens is that the speaker is emphasizing key content words to get their meaning across. All the words in between those stressed words or prominent words are going to be swallowed up and not articulated clearly. But a lot of those words are important in terms of conveying meaning. And the final thing is intonation. People try to match grammatical functions to intonation, and again, that doesn't work. Although David Brazil, his work on discourse intonation is very important, where you talk about proclaiming tones, where your voice goes down if you're making a statement, or it goes down if you're asking a WH question, and then calls that a proclaiming tone, and then the referring tone if you're talking to somebody and you're referring to shared knowledge, or if you're asking a question to which you know the answer, then there'll be a kind of going down and going up tone. But a lot of what's spoken about in the in teacher training books is a kind of artificial model of English. It's English as it should be spoken, but not as it is spoken in real life.
English as it should be spoken. It goes back to that concept that you've mentioned of English for modeling.
Yes,
which is
that's it.
another very interesting term. I want to go back to what you said about students being scared or people being scared of real language. I feel like a lot of language learners who have been on this, I think Mike will agree with me. It's a poor diet of input. Basically, they're receiving this impoverished source of English that is very well articulated, as you said, with perfect pauses, perfect rhythm, perfect stress, perfect intonation. And then when they are exposed to, and I'm going to use Richard Caldwell's analogy here of the messiness of spoken English, when they go out there into the wild, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to being in the, what is it called? The greenhouse.
Absolutely.
Which
yes.
is, so what I'm thinking is, what would be the first step for a teacher who has been, working primarily with this English for modeling and wants to switch and maybe start, making baby steps towards using authentic listening in the classroom? What would you say to someone who wants to kind of start making this sort of transition to provide students with perhaps a richer input diet.
Yes, that's interesting because a lot of the time when I'm at conferences, teachers come up afterwards and they say, "Oh, I tried using authentic listening with my students. It was a disaster." And it generally is, both for the teacher and the student, the first time they try and do it. But
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to roll it back a bit and just think about listening goals. John Field, back in 2008, said the problem with the way we teach listening is that there's no goals attached to it. What
Mm-hmm.
are we doing with it? And we tend to over rely on the listening comprehension approach, where you take in a recording, there's a load of questions, and the students answer them. You play the recording twice and you move on to something else. What I tried to do with my book was to come up with some listening goals that the teacher had in mind every time they're doing a listening activity. So to think about why they're doing that. What are they hoping
Mm-hmm.
their students will achieve at the end of this listening activity? Um, but something you mentioned is student anxiety. Yes,
Mm.
they do generally feel anxious when it comes to listening, particularly authentic listening. They're not in control. These words are flying past them at a rate of knots. They can't follow it. They don't recognize the words they know already, and it's rather traumatic. And again, with my hospital work, we always say to patients, if you're meeting a consultant, for example, and you're waiting for I want to say verdict, but a diagnosis of a condition, you're generally very anxious. And when we're anxious, we don't take in the message very well because the anxiety impedes our understanding. So, for example, with the hospital, we always say to people, make sure you go to an important appointment with someone because then together you can reconstruct what was said afterwards. But if you go on your own, as I know, then it's hard. You're anxious about the results, and so you don't take in the message. But in terms of listing goals, there's five I came up with, and these are really important. And the first one is increasing students' confidence. So,
Mm.
for example, if you took in a little, very short, authentic listening passage, say a recording of the news, then you had a list of questions with it, be open and honest with the students and say you don't expect them to get everything right. And in fact, when you're writing those questions or the task, make sure it's achievable with a bit of effort. But
Mm-hmm.
don't ask them impossible things because you're just going to make them less confident, and that's not the idea. So, taking in an authentic recording but with an achievable task will build up learners' confidence. And particularly, they will realize, hey, I can understand a real life English speaker. That's far more motivating than a course book recording that's been artificially written, graded to teach, say, the present perfect simple. Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. Can we before we move on to other
Yeah.
goals? I think you said something very important, which is this idea of really being honest with your students, telling them that you don't expect full comprehension. And I don't know if you are going to agree, but I would go as far as to say that not giving them a list of comprehension questions for them to just answer,
Mm.
but
Yeah.
perhaps give them a different task where, how much did you understand? What words did you understand? And
Yeah.
maybe kind of go from there. And I find,
Absolutely.
Sheila, especially when building confidence, and I don't know if you're going to agree with me, but I'm going to ask you this. When working specifically with students who are perhaps at A1, A2, let's say A2, B1, maybe A2, not working with longer texts, I find that in a lot of the institutions that I have worked at, a lot of the listenings were 4 or 5 minutes long.
Hmm.
And when they were using authentic listening, they were using very long stretches of
Yeah.
listening, as opposed to, let's work with this 1 minute passage here.
Yes. Or
Is
even
that a
shorter.
good way
Yes.
to increase their confidence?
Absolutely, and shorter is far better. But exploiting a short passage to the maximum is far better than not exploiting a much longer passage. But again, we're kind of locked in. The exam system. Generally, those recordings are 3.5 minutes long, and so that they are replicated in course books. But absolutely, with your students, just take in a very short recording, exploit it as much as possible. But
Mm-hmm.
something I did for 14 years when I set up the listening business, but I stopped doing that for various reasons, was every morning at 10 o'clock I would record the 2 minute news and then I would write three tasks, elementary, intermediate, and advanced level. So we're talking about 60 items. Um, institutions were recording the same news, and then I would send through the tasks with the answers for the teachers. So it was ready-made listening materials. And I did that for 14 years, which nearly killed me, but
Wow.
it was incredibly useful. And the feedback I was getting from institutions was the first time students were exposed to a real-life news program, which was only 2 minutes long. Um, so just think 2 minutes with 20 items per 2 minute recording on average. The first time the students were absolutely traumatized, maybe got one or two questions right, but then the next time they did it, they got three or four right, and the next time five or six right. And then by the end of maybe 6 or 7 sessions, they were getting nearly all of them right. And that's something I love about authentic listening, because the progress is exponential. You don't need to do a lot for students to make a huge amount of progress, and you can see their confidence soar, and that's why it's so satisfying.